And there is a lot of chatter amongst the tech community in Europe right now about, but I strongly believe that if you are a product manager today, or you are aspiring to become one, the skills you're developing will product management as we know it today as a discipline is actually...
Welcome to The Growth Switch, the podcast where we dive into the strategies, struggles, and breakthroughs of bold business leaders. I'm your host, Jules Fox, growth strategist and lead content creator at Aries Media. I'm here today to help uncover how today's top brands are scaling, overcoming challenges, and unlocking sustainable success. Now, for those of you just tuning in, Aries Media grows successful brands like yours with comprehensive hands-on support for sales, business development, and performance marketing. Go ahead and drop growth into the comments if you want to learn how to do that. Now, today we're fortunate enough to have Thor Mitchell on the podcast. He's a globally seasoned product leader and current executive in residence at Balderton Capital. He's known for guiding tech companies from startup to scale, including roles at Google, Miro, Crowdcube, and so many more. He's shaping the future of product leadership across Europe. Thor, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Yeah. So you've worked across every stage of company growth, from startup, scale up, hyperscale. What are some of the biggest product strategy mistakes that you see leaders making at each of these stages?
Yeah, I would say there are some core sort of common stumbling blocks that apply at almost every stage, I would say. One of the simplest but easiest trap to fall into is relying on your users or customers to behave the way you need them to behave in order to succeed. And I see this a lot, where you have product leaders who are so deep into their product, so deep into the context, and so, passionately believe in what they're trying to achieve, that they struggle to empathize with the perspective of someone who has none of that context or attachment and just is trying to solve a problem of their own. And so sometimes, the work I'm doing is really just to get people to take a step back from their product strategy, from their roadmap, and just answer some simple but often difficult to hear questions about, like, why would people actually give you their time and attention to understand what you're offering them? And why would they do what you need them to do in order for your product to be successful? And sometimes you just see people have these sort of facepalm moments in front of your eyes as they work through these, what seems like obvious questions, but just in the sort of, while they're spending their days on the front line, they've just sort of lost touch with that a little bit. So that's one thing. Another, I think really interesting question that's come up a lot in conversations I've had, and also actually has affected products I've worked on myself when I've been in operator roles, is the sort of the balance between short-term growth strategies and long-term growth strategies. And certainly what I've seen over the last couple of years as the macroeconomic environment has changed and the market's gotten more competitive, especially in the enterprise SaaS space, is businesses sort of tending to close ranks a little bit and focus much more on short term. And that's not a criticism. I think, that's very understandable. But it can be, if you're in a situation where there's sort of an existential risk that you're facing within the business, obviously securing the short term future of the business is imperative. But at the same time, I do see companies that are sort of not really planning ahead for kind of the bigger growth opportunities that might emerge beyond that. And so figuring out how to balance those two competing pressures is often challenging.
Right, exactly. How does that short term serve the long term goals? And also the blind spots can change as a company grows. What are some things that you see changing as a company that is having these short term wins, but not considering it in terms of the long term? What are some of those elements?
So I have my own biases here. It's probably worth declaring up front. A lot of the work I've done when I've been leading teams has been around ecosystems. So around developer platforms, around integrations and communities of people. And ecosystems are often more of a longer term strategy. They have to be cultivated over time. There are significant lags on business impact on the work you do around products that serve those communities, especially if you are actually bringing third parties into your ecosystem to build extensions or apps or things like that. There's also a certain amount of work you have to do to build confidence amongst your customer base that those entities can be trusted to extend your product. And that in turn takes time, and then you have to build that trust, and then you have to deploy those tools and so on. And so a lot of that work was always a longer term strategy. And I think, if you think about the sort of the stages of development of a business, obviously people normally talk about it in terms of fundraising, totally understandable. But if you think of it in terms of the product and the evolution of the product, there is sort of the challenges that are associated with, for example, going from SMB to enterprise. That's a big step. It requires a lot of careful thought and real, strategic thinking to navigate that. I would argue that the step from a sort of a standalone product to an ecosystem is equally large and requires a similar amount of planning and thought, but it doesn't pay off very quickly. If you can make it happen, then you have a really strong moat, right? If you look at the largest, most successful companies, the companies that have really, really grown to massive global scale, all ecosystems, right? It's sort of one of those last big leaps that you take when you get to like really large scale. But I have seen organizations step back from that a bit over the last few years, as it seems being that's a long-term future problem. We just don't have the bandwidth sort of, as a leadership team to focus on that right now. The problem is, of course, with these is if you delay that, you're taking something that already takes a long time and you're making it take even longer. So when you get back to it, it's going to take even longer to get there. So it's a difficult one. I think another reason why this is on my mind is, I'm based in the UK. I spend a lot of time focused on the European startup ecosystem. In fact, the company I work with now, Balderton Capital, they exclusively invest in European founders. And there is a lot of chatter amongst the tech community in Europe right now about why we struggle to create truly global scale businesses, of the scale of the big hyperscalers that you see coming out of the US. Sometimes, I see there's sort of a lack of ambition to go for those big leaps, those long-term bets. It's much more of a focus on short-term or like medium-term. I don't want to seem critical, but medium-term sort of profitability and operational efficiency rather than really kind of, if you excuse the analogy, swinging for the fences. Yeah. And so, that's kind of interesting. There are exceptions, obviously, to every rule. Stripe, for example, extraordinary success in terms of growing out of Europe and very much a sort of developer community focused business. But they are definitely the exceptions rather than the norm.
Yeah. So, you've been very vocal about the panic over AI replacing product managers. What's your take on where project managers are actually headed, and how should these emerging project managers position themselves for the future with the advent of AI? So they don't become obsolete.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's an understandable level of concern in the larger product management community about the impact of AI. And I don't want to seem dismissive of that, but I do find it frustrating the extent to which more influential voices are so eager to jump on the product management is dead bandwagon, which I don't think is particularly productive or healthy and is somewhat inconsiderate of people who are trying to break into the discipline right now. Have historically done a fair amount of work with younger people who are looking to break into product management. Both working with universities and business schools. I do advisor work for the product management program at the University of Oxford right now. And also I started the graduate recruitment program for product managers while I was at Miro and ran that for several years. And so I know there is a lot of interest in this as a career path in Europe now, which is great because that wasn't the case 10 years ago. In fact, product management really wasn't well understood as a career opportunity, particularly in Europe at that time. So we've made good progress in really raising awareness of the discipline as a exciting and enjoyable sort of path into the technology sector. So to then have a bunch of people who are just piling on saying it's not going to survive isn't particularly helpful. And the point I've been trying to make online, without wanting to sort of add more noise to that debate, is that product management as we know it today as a discipline is actually a relatively young discipline in the sort of the global scale of things. It really grew out of the shift to agile as a development methodology in the early 2000s, which in turn was a response to the shift of distributing software online rather than kind of on physical media. And yeah, you can trace it way back. The sort of the roots of the role you can trace back into the 60s, but as we know it today, it's very much kind of came out of that agile wave. So that makes it 25 years old, something thereabouts. And as a result, I'm old enough to remember a time before there was product management as we know it, and recognize it as just a specific shift, a specific role that arose in response to a specific change in the way that software is developed and distributed. The reality, of course, is that the way software is developed and distributed is changing again and potentially quite dramatically. So it's not at all surprising that some of the roles that are tied to the way we have been doing things for the last 25 years are going to have to change. And that may result in a new category of roles that we didn't have before, we didn't recognize before, It may result in some of the roles that we used to have not being needed in their current form, or even not being positioned the same way. They might not even have the same name. We might not even have a role called product manager in the future. But if you look at the fundamentals of the discipline, the thing that makes really, really great product managers really strong is not their ability to do the things that AI is good at. So there is a certain amount of craft in product management, which people tend to focus on a lot online, and which is often the sort of the essentials that new PMs do. Things like writing user stories, writing PRDs, doing market research, these kinds of tasks, which AI is proving to be quite effective at, and I think it's only going to get better. But actually, if you look at the really strong PMs, the ones that are later in their careers, their strength lies from their ability to coordinate people, right? To influence without authority, to inspire teams around a vision, to recognize ambiguity and drive it out of conversations, to understand the needs of customers and users in detail, recognize patterns, empathize with underlying challenges, identify emerging technology trends that can address those needs in creative ways, empathize with their stakeholders across the business, build relationships, build trust and confidence amongst the leadership team that the product team is doing well, understand the needs of the business. These are very human things. And I am not convinced that those skills will not be needed in the future. Right? They may be rebranded. They may be called something else, and the exact shape, the exact combination of them that you use on a day-to-day basis may change. But I strongly believe that if you are a product manager today, or you are aspiring to become one, the skills you're developing will continue to be valuable. So as long as you're not too attached to the title and the shape of the role as it is today, and you kind of maintain a growth mindset rather than a fixed mindset, and as long as you stay in touch with the way that the industry is developing and you develop with it, I think you'll be fine. In fact, you'll probably be in a very strong position.
Yeah. And it's one thing to believe something like you say, but it's another thing to do something about it. And I think you're very proactive in your own legacy. For instance, with your fractionals.fyi, I think that there's a radical new way to hiring, which is all these fractional product leaders. You hear fractional all kinds of things because it's what companies can afford. It's what actually works best for both the company and the person, partly because of the work-life balance, which I'd love to get into. But, I would like to hear more about, why you launched Fractionals and what it's for and who could best connect with it.
Certainly, yes. I would like to claim that it was some grand insight into the way the world is developing, but I would be lying. It was very much something that came about organically and somewhat reactively. The story goes, I left a full-time VP of product role at Miro in Amsterdam about a year ago and returned to the UK where I'm from after living in Amsterdam for a few years. And obviously, I was looking for a new role. I reached out to a few people I knew back in the UK to get a sense of the job market here amongst sort of executive leadership in the product space. And one of the people I spoke to was a partner at Balderton Capital. And I've known Balderton for over 10 years. They led the Series A round in the startup I was a CPO at back in 2015. And I've maintained that relationship ever since. And it just so happened that they now have this exec in residence program where they have experienced C-level operators from each of the major disciplines who are available to the portfolio as coaches and advisors. And the person they had for product was moving on. So they had this opportunity. So we quickly started talking about that. And I joined them in September of last year. And my role effectively is to be available to the portfolio as an advisor and coach. And at the same time, we have various other platform functions within the business to support companies that we've invested in. And one of those is a portfolio talent team. So a couple of really experienced people from the sort of exec recruiting space who work with portfolio leaders to help them place talent in the organization, particularly at the leadership level. And every so often, fairly regularly, I would say, a couple of times a month or more, someone will contact the portfolio talent team or myself, offering themselves to the portfolio as someone available to do fractional work. And I started to get this steady drip feed of people approaching the firm who were obviously had made the decision to move into fractional work and were keen to be connected with companies who might benefit from their support. At the same time, I'm part of a larger product leadership community in the UK and Europe, and I started to notice an increasing number of people I knew, really strong leaders I respected, making that transition as well, choosing to pursue more portfolio careers. And it has to be said, there are also some people who unfortunately have been affected by the layoffs that have hit the tech sector over the last few years. Some of them coming out of extremely strong, well-respected large companies who were looking to sort of convert that experience into fractional opportunities as well. And so I started keeping a list of all these people because every single one of them was interesting. They had a great background, all very different skills, experiences, different things to offer. I started sort of trying to keep track of all these people who were contacting us. Because although the portfolio rarely comes to me, to be honest, to say, can you recommend a fractional leader? I often get approached asking if I can recommend someone who can advise on a particular topic. So, hey, do you know someone who can advise us on product-led growth or on going up market or on international expansion or on how do we address the regulatory issues around this particular life sciences challenge or something like that? And so having this sort of network of people who have strong experiences across the board was really valuable. And so then back in January, I happened to mention on LinkedIn that I was building this list and I got inundated with people asking to be added to it. And before I knew, I had well over 80 profiles, which is, to be honest, more than I could realistically utilize. So, but it seemed like a good data set and one that was a shame to waste. And so I just thought, you know what, I'll stick it on the internet. And I'm not a software engineer, I'm not a software developer. And I was, if anything, excuse me 1 second. If anything, I was about a month early. If I'd have come to this problem a month later, I probably would have just adopted Bolt or Lovable or one of these, new AI powered prototyping tools. But my kind of early experimentation with the tools available at that time, I didn't find anything that really worked for me. And so although I'm not a software engineer, I've managed a number of developer products. And so I've maintained a sort of basic level of developer skills. And so I thought I'll just build something myself. So over the course of 3 weeks, I had a crash course in sort of modern web development because I hadn't done it for a while, and put something together, which was essentially just a database with a nice forms UI that allow you to filter on stage, discipline, sort of vertical and a couple of other key factors, and then invited people to sign up, and it started to sort of build, which was good to see. And then since then, I've just continued to iterate on it and improve it as really a side project alongside the work I'm doing with Balderton, but one that's very valuable because it helps me meet lots of interesting people. I'm building a strong network, and also because it's giving me a platform with which to also develop my own kind of understanding of the changes that are happening in software development right now. So although the first version of the site was very much built the old-fashioned way by hand, I've sort of now started to embrace these AI coding tools. That's really accelerated the rate of development, but also teaching me what these tools do well and what they struggle with. And then also starting to explore adding AI-powered capabilities to the site to reflect the fact that people's expectations of products and how they interact with them are changing. And so actually people expect more conversational interfaces now, and that gives you also more flexibility to handle sort of richer data sets without overwhelming people with very complex search forms and other like UI challenges. So it's been interesting and hugely valuable, and it continues to sort of tick over and develop. The challenge, being totally honest, is actually drumming up demand, right? So there's plenty of people who I know through my network are interested in fractional opportunities, but actually finding the companies that need their help is sort of a bigger challenge, and one that I'm focusing more on right now.
Yeah. And what's interesting is drumming up that interest and finding companies need their help. I don't think it's not that companies don't need their help. I think it's that a lot of business leaders don't necessarily think they need the help, and yet you've spoken about if you're the smartest person in the room, it's probably actually going to stall your company growth. So it could be very beneficial to get some fractional support and have another genius mind in the room advising and helping out. And you, having taken on the role as an advisor, deeply understand this as well. So maybe talk a little bit more about, what is an advisor able to do, and why should a company be considering hiring on fractional support?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's been really interesting talking to people who are doing this sort of fractional work. The ironic thing is that I'm not doing fractional work myself because I've obviously committed to Balderton, but I'm spending a lot of time with people who are. And obviously my Balderton work involves a lot of advisory and coaching work. It's not fractional in the sense that I'm not spending, 2 to 3 days a week on a particular business. I'm sort of spreading my time more broadly. But I think you're absolutely right. There are a lot of people who don't necessarily recognize that a coach, advisor, or fractional leader could really benefit the business. And it's not through pride or hubris or anything like that. They literally just don't think of it, right? In the day-to-day like intensity of running a startup or a successful technology business, particularly, it doesn't cross their mind that this could be a way to really accelerate the business or even just relieve some of the pressure on them and get in some fresh perspectives. I think, I spend a lot of time doing coaching, and coaching is interesting and a little bit different in the sense that, my take on coaching, and I think this is shared by quite a few other coaches I've spoken to, is that my job as a coach is not to tell you what to do. It's effectively to ask the right questions and help you think through problems with a strong sounding board in order to reach better quality decisions. But it's important that you, as the client, the person receiving the coaching, feels a sense of ownership over those decisions. I always say to people, the one thing that can never happen is that you find yourself in a board meeting being challenged on a particular decision, and your answer is, I did it because Thor told me to. That would be disastrous. So with coaching, you're very much like trying to walk them through the landscape that they're trying to navigate and help them figure out what feels right for them. And yes, absolutely, there are times when I might say, I've seen something similar to this before. This is what happened, and this is the decisions that we made, and this were the outcomes. And I'm trying to feed in experience, but I'm not saying, therefore, you should do that. Right. Whereas I think with fractional work, you have someone who can go that bit deeper. One of the challenges of coaching is that I can't go very deep. Right. And I don't have domain expertise across all the incredible variety of disciplines that Balderton invest in. And so I tend to focus more on cross-domain challenges like hiring or recruiting or building high-functioning teams, managing relationships with stakeholders and founders. Yes, I'll review board presentations. I'll help someone like dry run an all hands or something. But we're not going to go into the fine-grained details of the business strategy because I'm just not an expert on medical devices or selling secondhand cars or, running clinical trials and things like that. Whereas if you're doing fractional work, I think you can go that level deeper and, you have enough time to really actually take some ownership over the strategy, over the direction of the business, and bring some of that experience that you have from previous roles into the business and give them sort of an injection of fresh blood and an injection of fresh thinking, and just make sure that, as we talked about earlier, they're not tripping over very common mistakes that it's easy to make when you don't have anybody from outside the business who can really just hold you accountable to that. And so, the strongest fractional leaders I see are the ones that are very, very clear on their proposition. So they're not just sort of generic CTO or generic CMO. They understand very clearly what experience they have to bring into the business, and they position themselves accordingly. So they'll say, I am a specialist in enterprise SaaS, this kind of stage, in these kinds of sectors and verticals. And they'll be very targeted to make sure that they are joining businesses where they have real world relevant expertise they can bring in. And at the same time that they can differentiate themselves from other fractional leaders and make sure that firm feels they've really found a world-class expert here who can very quickly understand the challenges the business is facing and go much deeper than I could as a coach.
So in that light, you've come to Balderton. Clearly, you've had a relationship established with them for quite some time. What sort of vision did you come to them with for how you could help grow the company?
Yeah, it's a great question. The Exec in Residence program is really part of Balderton's larger strategy to differentiate themselves as a VC firm, and it's one of the benefits of working for one of the larger firms, particularly within Europe, that they have this sort of strong platform team that really helps support the portfolio, because ultimately. Excuse me, I think I was a little bit naive in a sense when I first started working with them, in that if you spend enough time in the startup space as an operator, you can fall into the trap of assuming that essentially the VCs are kind of like the pantheon, and all these founders are just sort of desperately trying to get their time and attention in order to secure investment from them. But the reality is that there are a finite number of investment opportunities on the table in any particular geography at any time. Most of the well-connected VCs are aware of all of them, right? I spoke to one of the partners at one point, this is a few years ago now. He said, I think with reasonable confidence that I have an awareness of 90% of the deal flow. So VCs, they are well equipped. They've got tooling and teams that help them understand who is raising right now. And so they know what opportunities there are. And that means that they're all competing for the strongest deals. Right. So I was really surprised at how much time the firm, the partners and the investment team as a whole spend selling. Now, I'm sure if you spend some time VCs, this is going to be very, very obvious. But to me, it was like, oh, I see. We're selling money, which is kind of strange. Or at least it felt strange to me. And so nobody wants to kind of, because money is effectively completely fungible. If you're just selling money, one person's money is no better than somebody else's money ever. These firms are looking for ways to add more value to an investment beyond just the cash. Otherwise, you end up in a race to the bottom on price, which nobody wants. And so one of the ways to do that is to really provide more support to the companies you've invested in beyond just the initial investment, by connecting them with a strong network. Balderton have done, and I know many other large firms, particularly in the US, do, is they've built this exec in residence program of experienced operators that are available at any time to the portfolio. And so really, when I came in, I'll be honest, I had a little bit of imposter syndrome, because my predecessor in this role was actually the CPO at one of the largest technology companies in Europe, like a really big name. And so I was a little bit concerned that this would be a bit of a downgrade. But it turns out that actually, as much as that person is extraordinary and an amazing advisor, most of the companies in the portfolio are not looking to get to that stage overnight. They're just trying to get to that stage. Most of Balderton's investments are at Series A. There is a growth fund as well, but it's a smaller number of larger tickets. So most companies are at Series A, and so they're obviously looking to get to Series B and C. And so the experiences I've had, particularly at Miro, where we went from 250 people to 2,000 people in just a couple of years, are very, very relevant and useful. And so from the firm's perspective, to answer your question, is I was bringing in kind of this relevant and very recent experience of rapid growth in the sort of the current technology and economic environment, plus also the network, right? So, a strong network within the product community particularly. And these are people who might go on to start a business that the company might want to invest in, or they might be people who the company looks to place into leadership positions within the portfolio in the future. Yeah. From my perspective, I also had an agenda. This was very important to me, that I understood what I was trying to get out of this. And one of the big trends in product leadership over the last few years, quite rightly, has been an increased expectation that product leadership is more commercially minded. And this comes back to, if you kind of rewind into the sort of the 2010s, there was arguably a period in which product management and product leadership as a result was somewhat purist, you could argue. They were very focused on the customer, very focused on the user. They believed if you just build great products, those products will effectively sell themselves, or at least that the responsibility of selling them was someone else's problem. Our job effectively was to make sure we were solving the needs of the customer, of the user, and building high quality solutions. And we didn't spend enough time thinking about the commercial aspects of doing that. Like, how is this product actually going to make money? How does it cost money? How does that impact the long-term growth and survival of the business? And a friend and kind of very experienced and respected product leader here in the UK last year coined this the product reckoning, which is this notion that over the last few years, as the macroeconomic environment changed, that became completely unacceptable. Now there is a strong expectation that people in product leadership positions need to deeply understand the commercials of the business, how the business makes money, how it spends money, and how the product and product teams impact that. And as I mentioned earlier in our conversation, a lot of my work has been on ecosystems, platforms, long-term growth strategies. These tend to be a little decoupled from the sort of the day-to-day challenges of making money, to be blunt, which is one of the more challenging aspects of them from a product perspective, because the success metrics are very lagging. And consequently, I felt like that was an area I needed to invest more in as well. And my strategy to do that was to go work for an investor, to be blunt, and really kind of understand, how do VC firms evaluate the potential of a business and the performance of a business over time, and get properly benchmarked across different verticals at different stages, and also understand how that's changing as AI changes the calculus overall. And so that's sort of my goal, is to really understand the VC space in more detail, but in particular, understand how they think of businesses through a commercial lens and work on those skills.
Yeah. I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. So, I really appreciate your time and expertise on the podcast. And is there anything else that you wanted to add to some of the people, to some of our listeners, to some of our viewers? They will be able to find all of the links where they can connect with Balderton, where they can connect with you personally down below in the show notes. Any last piece of advice that you would offer to these people?
I think so. I had a I had a really good conversation with the former CPO of Miro just a week before, a couple of days actually before he moved on. So I worked for a guy called Varun Palmer, who was the CPO at Miro for several years. He joined about a year after I did, and in that C-level role. He was previously the chief product officer at Box. So he had very, very strong enterprise SaaS credentials and was really brought into the business at Miro to drive that transition from primarily a PLG-led business to one that was more of a scaled sort of enterprise SaaS business, more of a sales-led growth model, and was very, very successful at driving that transition. But he moved his whole family over from the Bay Area to Amsterdam to do this, and after a couple of years, he needed to head back. And then ultimately, he's now subsequently joined Adobe as a general manager on one of their new AI marketing platforms. A couple of days before he left, I just had a final call with him, just sort of to say thank you, and sort of just pick his brains a little bit. And I said to him, okay, well, given you've worked with me for a couple of years, what advice would you give me for kind of, as I progress into my next chapter in the not too distant future? And then he said to me, and I'm not going to remember this exactly, this is sort of paraphrasing what he said, but it was along the lines of, look, everything is changing right now and we don't really know how. But if you don't change with it, it's going to be very, very challenging. So his advice essentially was find a business that really understands how AI is changing the space that they're in and is embracing that change and innovating on top of that change. And, find a business like that and join that business, become part of that journey. And, he said, because this is a rare opportunity to be, in the ground floor at something, one of these sort of like really tectonic changes that happen so very, very rarely. And that's something that I've really took to heart, and I've sort of passed that on to a few other people, who've asked for my advice since then. It's not about, I'm not trying to scaremonger, and I don't want to sound like I'm just parroting LinkedIn talking points. But I think there is a subtext there, which is if you're in product in particular, if you're not paying attention to these shifts and you're not open-minded in adapting to these shifts, you are placing yourself in a very vulnerable position in the future, in a few years' time. So I would say to people, kind of look at the environment you're in right now and really critically assess how seriously they're taking this AI powered shift. If you feel like they're not taking it seriously enough, then if you're in a position to do something about that, do something about it. And if you're not, find another opportunity where you can really immerse yourself in that space.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's absolutely great advice, especially in light of what we were talking about earlier. These products are shifting. The way they're creating products are shifting. That means companies are shifting. And if you simply try to do business as usual and say, hey, I'm really good at what we were doing 10 years ago, you're not going to be relevant anymore,
Yeah. And it comes back to this fixed mindset versus growth mindset thing. Because as I say, I'm not a big fan of all the kind of like the doomsaying and the sort of the headless chicken running around that's happening online. I think this is something that you can sort of work through this transition calmly and responsibly without panic. But I do think, it is a rare moment in history. And so there is a real opportunity to capitalize on it if you're just proactive about that.
Yeah. And I do actually have to note the humility that it takes to ask the question that you asked. You're clearly committed to your own personal growth that you asked. Hey, you've known me for a couple of years. And it's similar to something that somebody told me about ChatGPT. If you've worked with AI for a while, you can actually just ask ChatGPT. You can say, knowing my workflow and knowing what I work on, tell me what I could improve on. And you can discover that for yourself, if you're curious and you have that growth mindset.
Yeah. And it's really interesting you say that, because something that I have found at times frustrating after I moved into sort of roles where I was coaching or managing more senior people is how frequently I come across people, great people, don't get me wrong, like really strong, interesting, smart people who do not spend anything like enough time on their own personal development. And often it's actually because they lack the confidence to do it. Right. So someone who's maybe in their first leadership role, they're very focused on their team and helping their team develop, which is great. But it's maybe the first time in which they've been in a position where their immediate manager is not someone in their own discipline, or their immediate manager is not actively coaching them or actively managing their personal development journey. And they have to take responsibility to do it themselves. And so I'll see people who, they are reluctant to spend like learning and development budget on themselves. They want to make sure it goes to their teams, and they feel like somehow it's selfish to spend it on themselves. Or they are hesitant to get a coach because they feel like it's a sign of failure, when actually it's the opposite of that. It's a sign of strength that you'll want to lean into your own opportunities. And I think that's really, really important, that people just take a moment to think about, like, what do I need, and how do I hold my manager and my organization accountable to offering me those opportunities? Or if I'm in a senior leadership role myself, how do I make space for those opportunities to develop? Because things are changing, and I think I so often see people who feel like once they get to a VP level or a C level, somehow they're done, right? We made it to the top of the pyramid, nowhere else to go, no need to worry about like any further sort of personal investment. Especially right now, that's not going to work. That's not going to last. And so you've got to keep climbing the mountain just to stay where you're at the moment. So yeah, it's another great point that you've raised, which is like, be introspective, be self-aware, and maintain that passion to continue learning and developing, because it's particularly important right now.
Yeah. No, thank you so much for your time. Thor, do you pronounce it Thor?
Tor, yes.
Tor.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I should have asked you beforehand, but I didn't. Thor, it's been fantastic having you on the podcast. I really appreciate your insight. A lot of really good gems inside here.
No problem. It's a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Hey, for sure.